I welcome you all to our October meeting. Our speaker tonight is Neal Bascomb. He is a national award-winning author, and his topic tonight will be The Winter Fortress, the epic mission to sabotage Hitler's atomic bomb. And just a few of the housekeeping items. As always, please remember we're a self-funded organization. We have been receiving some contributions through the mail for our virtual helmet committee. We still have expenses that need to be paid. So any contributions you would be willing to send in would be most appreciated. And they're potentially tax deductible since we are a 501c3 organization. Please make your checks payable to Central Pennsylvania World War II Roundtable. And the contributions can be sent to the address you see on your screen. Now I'll turn over the meeting to our president, Charlie Lloyd. Charlie, you unmute yourself and then you can say a few words if you wish, and then lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Charlie.
Now I'm unmute myself.
Now you mute. Terry Hartzell, if you would be so kind to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Hello, it's good to be here. I have to say I've been looking forward to this for a long time, Neal, because about 5 years ago, I can't see me. Can you see me, Bob?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. I wanted to find out more about Adolf Eichmann, about the capture and extradition, and I found this book online. And when I got it, I couldn't put it down. It's riveting. It's a page turner. And I got in touch with Neal and I said, maybe someday you'll be able to address our roundtable. And, you know, here we are. But I can't say enough good things about this book. It's a narrative nonfiction, and it's just spellbinding. I read it the second time, right after I read it the first time. So I can't say enough good things about this. And then more recently, Neal has written this book, which is about a breakout at a POW camp during World War I, which is a different subject. And Neal, I have to admit, I haven't read this one yet. As you can see, I own it. It's in queue. It was on my Christmas list about 2 years ago. So I will get to it, I promise you. I'm really, really eager to read this one. And then in between these two books was this one, which is the subject of tonight's presentation. And I don't know if you're familiar with the author Alistair MacLean, anybody, but this is better than anything Alistair MacLean ever wrote because it's true. It's just, again, it's a page turner. I did read this one and I really enjoyed it. So I hope people will get enough information tonight. They'll go out and buy this as well if they haven't already. So Neal, again, it's just a pleasure to see you and meet you and hear you talk. I've been waiting for a long time. So with that, I'll turn it right over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Terry, for that very, very kind and very generous introduction. And I promise you'll enjoy Escape Artists as well. Please ping me when you finally get to it. Let me share my screen with you all so that I have a slide presentation tonight. Provide you some, so you just don't have to look at me talking. I wish I could be there in person. I'm only up the east of you all, or most of you probably, in Philadelphia. So perhaps at another time. So let me talk about Winter Fortress, the mission to sabotage Hitler's atomic bomb. But I like to sort of start this story because I don't want people to ever forget that this was the story about individuals. Certain individuals doing rather extraordinary things. And so as much as it's about these saboteurs and atomic physics and sort of beating Hitler to the bomb, at its very heart, at its very core, it's a story about people. And the first one that I'll introduce you to is Leif Tronstad. Leif was a Norwegian chemist and probably the most critical individual in the course of this story of stopping Hitler from getting the bomb. And this is, I'll start with a letter that Leif wrote his young daughter Sitzel while he was in England helping with the British, and his family remained in Norway. And she was wondering in letters that he got why he was away and why he couldn't be with her and his wife and her brother. And so this is what Leif wrote to Sitzel. We have to do everything for our land to make it free again. When we say our fatherland, we just don't mean the land which is beautiful and we also love, but also everything else we love at home. Mother, little boy, and you, and all the other fathers and mothers and children. I also mean all the wonderful memories from the time we ourselves were small and from later when we had children of our own. Our home villages with the hills and mountains and forests, the lakes and ponds and rivers and streams, waterfalls and fjords. The smell of new hay in summer, of birches in spring, of the sea and the big forest, and even the biting winter cold. Everything. Norwegian songs and the music and so much, much more. That's our fatherland, and that's what we have to do to struggle to get it back. Now let's talk atomic physics. That's why you all came this evening, I'm sure, for a little lesson in sort of what was the sort of heart of this story in terms of the aim. Now, heavy water, which is what the Norwegians were aiming to stop, is not dissimilar. I have a glass here, very not dissimilar from regular water that we drink. It has a single electron, a single proton, but heavy water has a neutron in its nucleus, which makes it heavier, which is why it goes by the term heavy water. And that's important in this story in terms of atomic physics because they had reactors where they needed to slow down the flinging around of atoms in order for the splitting process to self-generate. And so what heavy water did was it slowed down those atoms flinging around. It promoted the fission of these atoms and created a chain reaction. And so these heavy water reactors were absolutely critical for both the Germans as well as the United States in creating what we now know is plutonium. And plutonium, of course, was the bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. But in 1942, the Americans were very well aware, of course, of plutonium and what it could do, and so were the Germans. And both of these powers were really neck and neck in terms of their atomic research programs. Now, many of you may have heard of an individual named Werner Heisenberg, who was a Nobel Prize physicist, German, and was considered the center point of the German atomic bomb program. But the fact of the matter is, it was actually the individual with the glasses on my far right, Kurt Diebner, who was the head of the German atomic program. He was the one pushing for Hitler to obtain the bomb. Many of his colleagues thought that this atomic malarkey would never pay off. But once the Nazis came to power, once Diebner sort of pushed his theories and his thoughts on the obtaining of a nuclear bomb, he began to sway people and convince them that it was possible. And what he thought was possible was to create a heavy water reactor and to create plutonium. And the only place in the whole world that created heavy water at an industrial scale in the amount of tons that the Germans would need to create a heavy water reactor was in a place called Vemork in Norway. Now, this is a shot of the heavy water plant from a distance from across the valley. Vemork was located right outside of this little town called Rjukan, about 100 miles west of Oslo. It's set on the edge of this sort of icebound precipice, as you see here. It was all surrounded by what was called the Vita, which is about 3,500 square miles of frozen tundra. It was an extremely inhospitable place to live, to survive. But this plant would manage to extract the one molecule out of every 41 million in water that contains D2O, heavy water. And by the process of electrolysis, they were able to create industrial scale of heavy water production. Germans knew that this was the place to go if they needed it. And so in 1939, 1940, they went to the Norwegians and they went to Norsk Hydro, who owned this plant, and said, listen, give us all the heavy water that you have. And the people who ran the plant said, well, what do you possibly need all this heavy water for? And they would not say. And so the Norwegians said, well, you know what? We're not going to give you any of our heavy water. So April 9th, 1940, the Germans, not specifically to get heavy water, invade Norway and take it over in the matter of only a few days. But one of the first things that they do was send troops to Rjukan and send men into Vermont to take over the heavy water plant. And very quickly, they ramp up production there twofold, then fivefold, then tenfold. They needed 5 tons of heavy water, what they thought they needed for their heavy water reactor. Now this puts us back with Leif Tronstad. So Leif was the one who actually built this plant at Norsk Hydro. He was born in northern Norway. He was raised by a single mother. He was an extremely smart, intelligent, ambitious young man. He married early. He told his wife once he finished studying in Norway and then England and then in Germany, he told his wife, Bassa, listen, I can do 2 things. 1, I can teach, or 2, I can make us a lot of money by inventing things and going into industry. And what you have to know about Leif Tronstad is that he was an extremely vigorous man. He was constantly doing something. And so what he ended up deciding to do was both. He would teach full time, but he would also work in industry. And part of one of the first things that he did was to create the world's first heavy water plant. It was an utter and financial disaster for Norsk Hydro. Nobody wanted it prior to the discovery that it could be used in atomic physics. People around Rjukan used to joke that the heavy water was best used for skating rinks because it froze at higher temperatures. And that was about all it would be good for. Of course, the Germans and then the Americans knew differently. They take over the plant. Leif Tronstad goes into hiding. He starts fighting in the resistance in Norway for a period of months in 1940. And then when things got a little too hot for him and people were out hunting for him, he decided to put on his skis, ski to Sweden, and ultimately took a plane to London, where he wanted to be directly involved in the fight to free his country. And very quickly, given who he was, given his scientific knowledge, given his knowledge of Norsk Hydro and the heavy water, he found himself very quickly at this sort of nexus point between the Norwegian High Command in London and the British SOE, which I think many of you probably know is most famously called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. They were commandos. They went behind enemy lines. They performed operations. And so Leif found himself in this point because he knew about all the industry in Norway. He knew where to pinpoint what to sabotage. And of course, high up on that list was the place called Vermont. He partners with an individual named Colonel Wilson. And very early, by 1942, they begin putting together plans to attack the plant. So there's this famous letter or note in the archives in England talking about what the English called the Tube Alloys program, which was their atomic research program. And in April of 1942, a scientist at the Tube Alloy program wrote, since recent experiments have confirmed that element 94, which is plutonium, would be as good as U-235 for military purposes, that was enriched uranium essentially. And since this element is best prepared in systems involving the use of heavy water, the committee recommends that an attempt should, if possible, be made to stop Norsk Hydro production. And that letter, that note, was really the starting point for this tale of the sabotage of the German atomic bomb program. Churchill and Roosevelt spoke about it in June 1942 when Churchill came to the United States. At the meeting in New York, they made two very sort of clear decisions. One, of course, was the beginning of the Manhattan Project, but two was going after what Churchill called was this eerie, sinister material called heavy water. And they decided together that they would do whatever they could to hit this plant and to eliminate it. So if the British had kind of a secret weapon in Leif Tronstad, who knew the plant, who had built it, Leif Tronstad had a secret weapon in this young man here named Einar Schinnerlin. Einar was from the Rjukan area. He was born right at the dam that fed the water to the Norsk Hydro plant. He was essentially born with skis on his feet. He was an outdoor survivalist, a hunter, and a very tough individual. He looks very cheery here. I picked this picture in particular because he just looks like this innocent, fun young man. But Einar, probably of many of the individuals I wrote about in this story, is probably one of the toughest. So he decides in 1942 that he wants to participate in the resistance movement. He wants to go to England to learn to be trained as a commando and to come back and to fight for his country. So he makes his way. He tells his mother that he's going on a long hunt up in the Vida and that he will be away for a few months. Instead of going north, he heads south, west to the coast. By some chance, he gets into a skiing accident and absolutely rips apart his left knee. He decides he pairs up with a couple individuals who plan on commandeering a ferry boat and steaming it to England. But he's too hurt to go. His knee is too badly misshapen. And so the night before the taking over of the ferry, he goes to a surgeon and says, essentially, you need to perform surgery on my knee. I can't use it, and I need to get going. And they said, of course, you can stay here a week. We will take care of you. And he said, no, I need this now. I can't have any anesthesia because I can't be groggy. I need this to be taken care of. And so he recalls being strapped down to this gurney and having surgery on his knee without any anesthesia and suffering the sort of worst pain that he ever had. But getting through it, literally 12 hours later, he has a gun in his hand, is taking over this ferry and steams his way to England to learn how to fight. He arrives, and Leif Tronstad learns of this young man who happens to be from the Rjukan area, and so he sends for him. And Einar comes down to London, and he thinks, of course, that he's probably going to be trained for over the period of many months. He's going to learn how to fight. He's going to learn how to be a saboteur. But Leif Tronstad says, you're going to go back now and be my eyes and ears on the ground in Rjukan in the Wehrmacht area. And you need to get back as soon as possible because we don't want people to know that you were gone anywhere else other than that hunting trip. And so Einar trains for one day, really 2 days, 36 hours actually, to learn how to parachute out of a plane and to get rudimentary instruction on how to use a wireless radio. He finds himself very quickly in a Halifax bomber racing over the North Sea. They get over Norway. And what I love about this story is that, you often hear these young men and they have no fear and they are gung-ho all the way through. Well, Einar is literally gripping the sides of this hole in the bottom of this Halifax bomber, refusing to jump, right? He's just scared. He's scared of heights. He won't go. And at the end of the day, the individual in charge of the jump essentially just nudges him out the hole. And he lands, gathers his material, returns home, still on that bum knee. And his mother asks him, how was your hunting trip? And he said, well, it's just, it was great. and he goes back to work. But now he's working for the SOE and working for Leif Tronstadt as the eyes and ears on the ground. And Einar is the one who is finding out everything about the Vermont plant that Leif would not know. What the guard rotations are, what the security measures are, what kind of locks are on the door. Everything that you would know about this plant. Sketches were made so that Leif once joked that he could build it from scratch, given everything that Einar Schinnerland provided him. This is actually not Einar in the parachute. There were no cameras when he arrived, but just to give you a sense of where he landed, this is the Vita. Okay, this is where he would have landed and made his way home. So the British, Leif, now have all the information they need. Now a plan has to be put together on what to do about the plant. What kind of operation? How are we going to destroy it? Now the Americans want to bomb it from the air. They just want to sort of take a run at the plant and destroy it. There's two issues with that that Leif made very clear. One, there's about 5,000 innocent Norwegians living in Rjukan. This valley, as you saw in that picture, is sort of a slotted canyon, so it would be very difficult to hit this plant. It's made of tens of thousands of pounds of concrete and steel. And so Leif says, you know, you can bomb that thing day and night, but you'll be lucky to hit it. And even if you hit it, the heavy water factory is at the core of this plant. You probably won't even damage it. And so the British and the Americans are convinced that a bombing routine would not work. So they'll have to send in saboteurs. And so they decide that they're going to send in two teams of British Royal Engineers, two teams of 15 sappers to go in the area by glider plane, a Horsa glider, float down into this lovely countryside that you see here in around November, December of 1942. And these Royal Engineers who'd never seen this land, and some proposed bringing a bike to help the transport, if you can imagine. They're going to make their way to the Wehrmacht plant, bust inside, overcome the security and the soldiers, and blow it up. So that is what is called Operation Freshman. Now it's called Operation Freshman because no Allied combat effort had ever been made with Horsa gliders. So this was the first run ever. So Leif convinces the British, okay, if you're not going to use Norwegians, which he promoted, then to actually perform the sabotage, let's send an advanced team of Norwegians to prepare the ground for the attack, to be the signal in the area for the drop operation, as well as to be used as guides to the plant. And so Leif Tronstadt collects 4 men, Jan Anton Paulsen, who's on top here, Klaus Hellberg's on the left, in the middle, Arne Kjellstrup, and Knut Haugland on the right in the suit. He would be the radio operator. These were all men from the area. They knew the Vita. They knew how to survive in the winter, in that winter conditions. And so they were ultimately sent in the fall of 1942. They were dropped in the Vita. They landed a long way from where they were supposed to be. And they had hundreds of pounds of equipment. So what they essentially did, the 4 of them, was ski a few miles with their packs, drop them off, ski back empty-handed, pick up their next pack, ski back, and they made their way back and forth, slowly making their way to the Rjukan area over the next 3 or 4 days. They were on the ground. They have their signal ready. They're in contact with the British. They're sending weather reports because the Vita, as I said, a very inhospitable place, was a place of sort of very tempestuous weather. Temperatures changed dramatically. Snow came at any hour. The legend was it grew so cold, so fast there that flames froze in the fire. That was the legend of the Vita. And so these 4 men in what was called Operation Grouse, they were going to be the ones to say, this is the perfect time to land, come now. And so you have these Royal Engineers seen here on this slide, brave young men in November 19th, 1942, go on this mission called Operation Freshman. They're not told really anything about the mission other than that it could decide the fate of the war. They were given the opportunity to back out. Not a single one backed out of the operation. They were put in these horse gliders, which many people called wooden coffins. Being inside of them was akin to being on a bucking bronco. They were made of wood. They had corrugated steel on the floor, largely for vomit, so that the floor would channel away and they wouldn't slip. There were very little harnesses, and they were towed behind these Halifax bombers. So on the 19th, Newt Haugland sends an early morning transmission that the weather is clear, that the mission should go ahead, and these planes take off from England and make their way over the North Sea at night, because that's really the only time that they can land without being seen. The weather changes for the much worse that evening. By the time they come over the area, it's ridden with cloud cover. They can't see where the drop site is. The 4 men from Operation Grouse hear the sound of the engines, but nobody comes. And they're radioing back England, no one's come. Where are the planes? We haven't heard anything. Tragedy had sadly struck Operation Freshman. The first Halifax bomber crashed into a mountainside, taking its glider with it. The second Halifax decided to break their horse glider loose so they could get away, and so that the glider had a chance. That glider crashed also into a mountainside. Those young Royal Engineers who weren't killed on impact, many of them were mortally wounded. They were captured, taken by the Germans. Those in good enough shape were tortured for weeks, and then ultimately killed. 41 men lost their lives in Operation Freshman. Not only that loss of life, but the Germans found out exactly what these Royal Engineers intended to do, which was to hit this plant at Vermont. And so now Germans know this, and they double, triple the security at the plant because they know the Allies want to go after it. Not 24 hours later, Leif Tronstadt goes to Colonel Wilson and says, I want this operation. I want to take it over. I want my men to do this job. Please let me. And the British, in some sense, were wanted to sort of wash their hands of it. I mean, it was an utter tragedy, Operation Freshman. Everyone knew about it, all the way to Churchill. And so if Tronstadt wanted to sort of take it over on his own, then they were going to let him. So this begins what we call Operation Gunnerside. There were 6 men in this operation, and I know this image only has 5, but the 6th was an individual named Newt Haugland, whose nickname was Bonzo, and he certainly had earned his nickname, and I'll show you a slide of him next. This mission, Operation Gunnerside, was led by 23-year-old Joachim Ronenberg, who's the individual in the first row on my right. Again, 23-year-old, no combat experience, had, like these other gentlemen, come over to England, been trained by the SOE over many months. Ronenberg spoke English very well, and he just had a quality that his British instructors thought would make for an excellent leader in this operation. They gave the second in command to Bonzo, as I had already introduced. Bonzo had seen a lot of combat in the fight for Norway, had operated in the resistance, He was a weathered soldier, and he would be the second in command of this mission. Ronenberg was a very fastidious, well-organized leader. He spent weeks putting together supply lists, everything that they would need to survive in the Vita, the bombs that they would need, the training that they did. They created a mock plant of Vermuck in order to be very quick once they ultimately got into the plant. And so many weeks, many months were spent in this training effort because they couldn't go. They couldn't go to Norway because winter had set in, and dropping parachutes, men into that area in the height of winter was just not going to be a possibility. The problem is you have Operation Grouse, you have Paulsen, Hellstrup, Haugland, and Hellberg in the area being hunted by the Germans. And so they go to a remote corner, a remote cabin in the Vita, hundreds of miles away from the town in the midst of winter. They have no supplies, no food. They have their guns and what they had brought with them when they were dropped, but that's about it. They had to hide a lot of their things to get away quickly. So they went to this cabin and essentially survived on reindeer, hunting reindeer for the next 3 months. They ate literally everything from the grass that the lichen that the reindeer would eat to what they called their greatest delicacy, which was the fat behind the eyelids of these reindeer. It was a really tragically cold winter. They barely survived. It was so cold that the hoarfrost inside the cabin was slowly going in on them, losing space. They were getting weaker and weaker, but they ultimately survived through February, when finally Operation Gunnerside, led by Ronenberg, lands in Norway. They land in the worst winter storm that the Vita had seen, and just sort of continuation of terrible luck. People are being literally blown off their feet. They have to hunker down for another week before they can meet together in this cabin that you see. This is a picture of the actual cabin that overlooked the Vermuck plant where they stayed. Now they have to decide how they're going to hit the plant. The Germans expect an attack. There's essentially two main ways to go about getting into the plant. You can see they could go from above down the pipelines that fed water to the plant, or they could go across the single lane suspension bridge that connected the plant to the other side of the valley. Ultimately decided that neither of those two were going to work. Schinnerland surveyed the guards. There were booby traps everywhere, a huge guard contingent after the attack was discovered, and so they need to find a third way. And they ultimately decide that they're going to rappel down this canyon that you see here, and then climb up the other side, and then go along the railway track to the plant. Now, February 27th comes, and this is exactly what they do. They approach this way, they come down this hillside, they take off their skis, they rappel down into the valley, and then realize they come up to the face of this cliffside that they have to climb, which is about 500 feet tall. Ronenberg recalls thinking that it looked, that it was later in life, because he hadn't seen one until then, that it resembled a skyscraper at night. Again, late February, icebound, and they have to scale this cliffside with their bombs and their gear and their guns to get into the plant unseen. And so that's what Operation Gunnerside does. Thankfully, they knew everything about the plant. everything down to the air duct tunnel that they could secretly crawl through to drop down inside the heart of the plant where the heavy water was. And they blew up the plant and then hightailed it out of there, went down the cliffside, all the way almost towards Rubicon, climbed up this essentially logging road to the top of the Vita, a couple thousand feet, and then made their escape into the Vita. And this is actually a scene from the movie, but gives you an idea, because it was shot in this territory, of what it was like and the sort of experience that they had. Now that's roughly half of the story. I will not keep you here all night with it, but I do want to sort of point out two things that sort of, I think, encapsulate this story about these men. One is just their sheer toughness. I talked about Schinnerland, but I'll just give you another anecdote. Klaus Hellberg, after the sabotage, he makes his way to Oslo and then returns to the Vita because he needs to move some supplies from this cabin that they had secured some additional explosives from. So he skis about 25 miles there in the morning. He arrives there, takes off his skis, goes into the cabin, starts setting things up. There's now a manhunt for these individuals on the Vita by the Germans. He looks out the window and sees 3 skiers coming his way in German uniforms. Klaus runs out of the cabin, puts on his skis, and you have this really sort of epic ski chase through the mountains, up and down valleys, mile after mile after mile of cross-country skiing, Klaus trying to escape. He eludes 2 of the 3, but the 3rd will not let him go. Ultimately, he climbs the top of this hillside. He has the sun facing the sun, turns around. The German skier, he actually turned out to be Austrian, fires his weapon at Klaus, misses. Klaus shoots him once. The Austrian skier fell down over his skis, sort of terribly wounded, and Klaus takes off again, knowing there'll be others following him. It's now nighttime. He skis and skis and skis off the side of a cliff, drops about 50 yards, breaks his shoulder, snaps his ski pole, skis another 20 miles through the night to the safety of a town using one arm and his skis. Arrives, goes to a hotel because he's so exhausted. That hotel just turns out to be taken over by the German high command in the area that same evening. Klaus is taken, put on a bus. They don't know who he is. He forces his way out of the bus and skis again. These are the kind of individuals and what they had to do to survive. Just the sheer toughness of them, not only this sort of remarkable story, but the many months in that cabin where they were just, if they did not survive this, Gunnerside had no one to take them to the plant. And so their survival and their toughness was actually critical to the success of the operation. And the other thing I would point out that sort of symbolizes this story or encapsulated is sacrifice. Every single one of these individuals, except for Jan Paulsen, didn't really know what the purpose of the mission was, weren't really told what it was about, certainly weren't told it was about an atomic bomb, but they were just told, this is important for the war and we need your help. And so they did it. They lived many months, as I said, in misery, their family only hours away. Schinnerland had 2 of his best friends and his brother taken by the Germans, tortured, one of them killed. Haukelid, as just another example, decided to stay after the sabotage, learned that the Germans had reconstituted the plant rather quickly and has to put together another operation to go after the plant. So he goes to Oslo, He hadn't seen his family in 3 years, and is in an underground safety house, and he hears a knock on the door, and he's staying with a friend of his, and he hears a knock on the door, and the door opens, and he hears the voice of his father. And he wants nothing else in this world than to sort of push himself out of the closet, embrace his dad, who hadn't seen, who he knew had suffered because of his association, that Haukelid was known as a saboteur, but couldn't, for safety's sake, couldn't talk to him. And that was really that was the last time he would have a chance to see his father. His father was taken by the Germans again, imprisoned, ultimately broken, and died soon after. And actually, Haukelid wrote his memoirs, and the dedication in his Norwegian memoirs was to his father. And it was a rather poignant, simple line. He died not knowing why. Now, I'll just conclude with saying, was this operation important? And I'm sure this is probably a very smart crew who knows about the atomic program of the Germans, and perhaps knows about them dropping off from the project at a certain point, not putting as much money in as the Americans, by no means putting together a Manhattan Project. I would argue that this operation was part of the reason that the Germans did not get a bomb. I wouldn't say it's everything, but I will point out that Kurt Diebner was told in 1942, as he's getting this heavy water and doubling this production and tripling it, that if he could get a heavy water reactor working, if he could show that he could create plutonium out of it, the German high command would give him every resource in the world to create a bomb. And he was ultimately unable to get a heavy water reactor working because he could never get enough heavy water into his hands. So is it enough for that? For this, it's certainly an important part of the story of the German atomic bomb program. And I'll end with Tronstadt, where I began. He ultimately decided that he couldn't stand sending young men anymore back to Norway to fight. He wanted to be there personally. And so ultimately convinces the high command and the SOE to send him in 1945. He lands, parachutes in. He puts together a resistance army of about 4,000 men, but ultimately is killed by a collaborator and never got to see the end of the war or his family. But he did write this note that he left in a safe in London in the case of his death. And I think it goes to the heart of who he was, what he was fighting for, and really sort of tethers back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, about this story being about sort of normal individuals doing extraordinary things, and really what the nature of patriotism is about. This is Tronstadt's last letter to his wife. Dearest Bassa, I've had the honor to lead an important expedition home, which will be of great importance to Norway's future. It is in line with the course I chose on April 9th, 1940, the day of the German invasion, to put all my effort and ability toward our country's welfare. The war is singing its last verse, and it requires effort from all who would call themselves men. You will understand that, won't you? We have had so many magical, happy years, and my highest wish is to continue that happy life together. But should the Almighty have another course for me, know that my last thought was of you. Time is short, but if all will not go well, don't feel sorry for me. I am completely happy and thankful for what I have had in life, even though I very much would like to live to help Norway back to its feet. He wished the best for Sitzel and Leif, his son, and he says he looks forward to seeing them all again. And the letter was signed, your beloved. That is the story of, or at least a part of it, of Winter Fortress. And I'd love to take any questions you have. I feel like I ran through it pretty quick, but I've now been talking for almost an hour. So
It was a good teaser,
Excellent.
I do want to point something out though, Neal, and I just want to congratulate you. It's a mechanical thing, it's not the writing, but I don't know if you can see this, people can see this. you did something at the beginning of the book I wish every book had, which is a cast of characters, which has all the names, especially, they're a little confusing because they're Norwegian and so forth, but it just saves you a lot of time having to look in the back of the book. And you've also done that with the escape artists, I noticed. So thank you for doing that. And I just wish everybody did that. I do have a couple, I think we'll have to go back and read your book because it's been a couple of years since I read that. Got me intrigued again. I do have a few questions, and I was wondering about this myself. The person had asked about whether there was a sabotage of a boat that was carrying barrels of heavy water in a Norwegian fjord. And was that related to this in any way and to your story?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As I said in the talk, I gave you about half. So what happens is, not to give away too much, but I'll give you the broad brushstrokes. So they attacked the plant in February 1943. They blow it up. The Germans reconstitute it. By the summer of 43, Tronstad is informed that the plant is back in production. This time, the Americans sort of had their way. They decided to bomb the plant. LeMay sends over his bombers. And what happens is exactly what Tronstad thought would happen. A number of civilians in Rjukan died. The plant was barely harmed. It was out of production for a few weeks, but then starts again. And so the Germans largely, at this point, they decide, what, the one good thing that came out of the American bombing is the Germans decide the Allies are not going to give up here, right? They're going to keep attacking until this thing is over. And so they begin to disassemble the plant and then bring all the heavy water. They want to bring it all to Germany now. And so the plan is to bring them in barrels. They fill barrels of heavy water and then are going to transport aboard this boat called the Hydro, which crosses this ferry from basically a Vermont plant to Rjukan by rail. And then a ferry boat takes a couple hours across a huge lake to another rail side, and then onward towards Oslo and then Germany. Knut Haukeled, who I mentioned, Bonzo, was the one put in charge of sabotaging that ferry. And it was a very tough decision, you can imagine. He radios back to England and says, is this absolutely necessary? Because this is a passenger ferry, the Hydro. And so there'll be a number of Norwegians on it. There'll be the heavy water. There'll be this huge German guard. But if the plan is to sink this boat in the deepest part of this lake, civilians are going to die. And he makes that very clear to England. Tronstad and Wilson know that everything must be done to limit the heavy water, and so they give him the order to go. And he, performs his mission flawlessly. The ferry went down rather quickly in the deepest part of the lake. A number of civilians died, and that heavy water, most of it remains now at the bottom of that lake.
Thank you. A couple of people wanted to know, why were they producing heavy water in Norway? Why not some other geographical location or someplace even closer to Germany?
So what you need to do to create heavy water, you sort of need two critical ingredients. You need a lot of cheap power, and then two, you need a lot of water. So, and you need the technology. You need the electrolysis machines, which essentially boil and distill the water down till you have a concentrate of heavy water. And this was one of the largest power plants in the world. It already had this electrolysis devices, and so it was a natural fit. They'd taken over the country. They saw no reason why they wouldn't be able to produce it there and bring it south safely. They did explore, the Germans, after the first attack, explored other options to create heavy water, but they were frankly unfeasible at that point of the war, particularly when the Germans decided they weren't going to invest any money until the science was proven out.
Next question, and I like to ask this whenever I can of any author: what made you choose this subject to write about, and how did you go about doing the research?
Yeah, so I've always had a fascination with the atomic program, all of it. Not only the science, but the individuals, everything from the creation of the atomic bomb to the post-war nature of atomic research and the spies that were involved in the Cold War antics that went on. And Richard Rhodes's book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, was one of my favorite books, period. And I read it several times. And in that book, if any of you have read it, is this little vignette about the Gunnerside attack. And I thought, wow, that would make a great novel, right? And so I was like, maybe I should write this as a novel. I'd always like to be a novelist. That sounds nice. And then I started researching it, and I was like, this story is so good. Why would I ruin it by trying to novelize it? And so I went over to Norway to really begin the research in earnest and to see if there was enough sort of primary material where I could tell this story in a way that had never been told before. And I ended up meeting Leif Tronstad Jr., Tronstad's son, who at the time was about 60 years old. And he was initially reluctant, but finally, after a few sessions, he said, "Why don't you come with me into my library?" And he took me into his library, and he had just walls of black binders. And in those black binders was just a wealth of primary research. He had documents that the Norwegian government didn't know he had. He had every letter his father wrote. That his Tronstad Sr. wrote a diary every single day since the beginning of the German invasion. And I'm not talking the weather was nice today. I'm talking like a page every day. And it was in code, but the son had deciphered the code over years. And so ultimately, I got all this information from the son, and it was just this incredible treasure, and really sort of told the heart of the story, which is Tronstad. I mean, the saboteurs are super important, and they're the ones on the ground making things happen. But the humanity of Tronstad and my access to that, thanks to his son, I think for me made this story what it is, because he was making decisions that were really tough, and not only tough in terms of am I doing the right thing, but like moral choices. Is it worth killing 100 civilians if we stop the Germans from getting the bomb? 100 civilians, many of whom I may know, and sort of understanding that was really important to me.
Somebody mentioned the movie, The Heroes of Telemark. I was going to ask you about that. I don't know, were you familiar with that movie? I mean, I may have seen it way back when, but I know it's a fictionalized account, but I didn't know if it was even close to what really happened.
Yeah, I think it was Kirk Douglas. I think I saw it on a Saturday matinee one day when I was a kid, and it probably fascinated me in ways that I can't recollect. But yes, it's a very sort of classic Hollywood fictionalization of the story. I think the most curious point is that Newt Haugland, who was the radio operator, was turned into a woman and a love interest.
I
have to say, I spent a lot of time with Haugland's sons. They're the ones who took me up to the Vita and took me to these cabins and let me shoot those World War II weapons and taught me some survival skills out there, and stayed in huts surrounded by snow. And I was wearing Newt Haugland's long underwear, and they just would not let it go. that their father was a woman in one depiction of it. And so I would not say it's accurate.
Trying to think if there's any other quick questions I can ask you here. Not really. Well, how long did it take you to write? How long did it take you to do all that research?
This book was about 4 years start to finish, which is a little bit longer, about a year to 18 months longer than a typical book of mine. And I'd say that's a few things. One, just sort of understanding atomic physics to the level was really hard, and trying to convey it to readers in a way that was simple was a challenge. But I just had so much material. The Norwegians were incredibly generous. And so I had information from all the families, letters, diaries, everything. And it was all in Norwegian. So there was a lot of translation. And then, of course, Britain has a lot of course, all the SOE files. And so I spent a lot of time in London getting those. And so it was a lot of research, but I have to say, probably one of my favorite books that I have researched, because I got to spend so much time in that area. And it's beautiful land, if harsh.
One of the pictures you showed were some cross-country skiers, and I think you made a reference to this is from the film. What film were you referring to?
I think that may be from the Heroes of Telemark.
Oh, okay. I did a documentary on your book, or at least on a similar subject.
No, I'm pretty sure that's actually from the film, or it's a recreation. But my recollection is it's from the film. And people do recreate this journey that these Norwegians made. You'll find when I was in the Rjukan area, I was staying at a little hostel about couple miles north of the area. And one morning, a bunch of British special forces soldiers came in. They just skied 100 miles of the route that the Norwegian saboteurs did. And it's a sort of training exercise now for wilderness survival.
Wow. Is there anything
winter wilderness survival.
Is there anything left of the heavy water plant that was sabotaged?
There is. So the actual heavy water plant, no. Although they have uncovered part of it recently, but the plant itself is the power plant itself is still there, and has if any of you find yourselves end up being fascinated by this story, I do suggest going out. You can see it. They have a wonderful museum in it. You get a real sense of the territory and the land, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I just suggest not going in February.
Maybe we should do a roundtable road trip. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. How about July?
I think, June. You're thinking June.
June's good? Okay, good.
Well, Neal, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm going to turn it back over to Bob for his traditional presentation. Right, Bob?
Wonderful. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Neal. I know Terry mentioned this before, but here are some of the other books authored by Neal. I have orders in for Hunting Eichmann and for Red Mutiny, Neal. So hopefully they'll arrive in the next day or two from Amazon. So
great.
Greatly appreciate it. You may be disappointed to learn, but we do not pay our speakers. So, however, I will be more than happy to send you, let's see.
Oh, I love that. I love a good coffee mug.
It's a good coffee mug. I don't know if you can see that there. Yes. A collector's edition of our Central Pennsylvania World War II Roundtable mug. You have my email somewhere in your,
yes.
If you would send me your address, I'll put this in the mail for you. It works great for coffee, but also for other adult beverages. So I will be using mine very shortly for some highly anticipated bourbon.
Oh, excellent.
So thank you. Thanks again. It was a fascinating story.
Can I just
And
jump in? Can I jump in one more time? I'm not done. I'll turn my mic off. Neil, I understand you'll be addressing a group, Harrisburg area group in March, a Holocaust Center for Wayne Penn or Penn State Harrisburg. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes. I
Yeah.
have to check the date, but yeah, I generally check my calendar like a month before. So,
Well, okay. Well, my friend Neil Lyford, who's a professor there, I told him about this book and he went out and bought it. So he's involved in that speaker thing. I think he mentioned he had been in touch with you. So
Great.
I may see you in March.
yes, that'd be nice.
okay.
I'm done now, Bob, for real.
Hey, thanks, Terry. I appreciate that. So, and as we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody about our meeting next month, Thursday, November 4th at 7 p.m. Our speaker will be Susan Eisenhower, and she's the author of a recent book about her grandfather, How Ike Led. And we hope to see you then. And we thank everyone for joining us this evening. Neal, again, thank you so much. It was a fascinating story. I, like Terry, is going to have to go back and read that book again. So
Thank you.
I'll have to dig it out of my archives. So,
Well, thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
all right, thank you. And with that, we're adjourned for the evening.